Hey everybody, this is Vegan Theology, episode 40 with Sarah and Kevin Hale. What's going on?
Hey everybody, and thank you for being here. Thanks for making time out of your day to listen along with us. We appreciate you very much. We're here today to discuss our interview with Dr. Rillera.
Yeah.
There were definitely things that we didn't get to. There were things that we were just running out of time and would have loved to go deeper into.
Yeah.
And so this is our opportunity to do some of that, even though, of course, Dr. Rillera is not here to enter into the dialogue, which isn't fair to him.
Right.
We definitely are going to try not to misrepresent him.
I think the one thing that we both got from him was he was very kind. He's very generous, and I think he's very scholarly and he's very pastoral. So he seemed like a really nice mix. I think he's definitely a great thinker. So we know the things we want to discuss in this conversation right now. We know that if he were in this dialogue, he would have a counter response. And so we're not necessarily holding him to anything, but I think we felt the need to express some of our views. And maybe some of the things we say would lead to further dialogues and questions and things like that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, he's a lot of fun to talk to. I love his laugh.
Yeah, he was awesome.
Yeah, so we started out the interview talking about his background, and he gave us the story of his family background, some of his spiritual background, and his academic journey as well.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating. Even in that part of the conversation, I was like, whoa, I want to go further with that. And I want to ask you more about that.
I know.
What was that like?
Right.
But we couldn't. I could tell, oh my gosh, time's going to fly. We just have to keep moving. But one thing that I came away with was his description of his mother. As a mother myself, it was so wonderful to hear how he was clearly very influenced by his amazing mother.
Yeah.
He describes her as being very gifted, very curious, very intellectually motivated. And the fact that she modeled for him that it's okay to question what you've been told and explore it for yourself and even reject and walk away from things. The fact that she was raised Reformed Jewish and then converted to Jehovah's Witness and then left that and went into, I believe, some form of evangelicalism.
Yeah.
And then that gave him perhaps permission and freedom to do his own journey.
Right.
He was able to walk away from the Jehovah's Witness community.
Yeah.
And he ended up walking away from evangelicalism at some point. We don't really know that story at all.
Right.
And now he's an Anglican. I was just thinking, that's just one more reason that his students are so blessed, because how often do you get a mentor who wasn't raised in the faith that they're professing today? They've actually been on this long journey of exploration and honesty.
Yeah, and I thought it was pretty powerful. Well, I'll just say this, his description of their study methods at Eternity Bible College, how they had like a survey of the entire Bible, and then they went a little deeper, and then they had another iteration where they got real specific. Sounds like there was this method to really analyzing scripture in totality and really trying to, as he might have mentioned, or he did mention, kind of connecting the dots. And I don't know, it really sounded like it was a really great education. I mean, I was like almost envious, like, ooh, that sounded amazing. So, and also I think we both recognize that, I mean, kind of what you're already saying about Dr. Rillera is just the courage to write Lamb of the Free, and knowing that he was writing that book that was dismantling penal substitutionary atonement would limit his employment options teaching at many schools, because many Bible colleges and seminaries are evangelical, and some faith statements that professors have to sign make them, or pretty much make them agree to PSA. The fact that he was willing to write the book and limit his options, and yet God is taking care of him. So it's pretty amazing. It's pretty courageous.
Yeah, I also loved his description of how he views teaching. It's clearly this very collaborative, reciprocal relationship. I think that's some of the language he uses, that he enters into a dialogue with his students. It's very much a give and take relationship. envious of his students is a fair thing for
Yeah.
both of us to say. Of course, we talked about the book in general, like how it's been received and how long did it take him to write it, and just getting into some of the takeaways of that part of the conversation. I really loved how even when we're talking about the wrath of God, clearly there is such a concept as the wrath of God, but I loved how he described how the wrath of God cannot be unhitched from God's ultimate action of redeeming all things. Mm-hmm. That God's wrath or God's curse is always penultimate or second to last in the plan. And that blessing is always the ultimate state.
Right. Yeah, that was pretty fascinating. Yeah, it's good stuff. I mean, I'm hoping, kind of what we've been saying here, that in time, this will just seep into the culture, the whole thesis of Lamb of the Free. And I think we are starting to see some of that, and that eventually PSA will become an optional, not an essential belief, even though it never was an essential belief, but, you know what I mean, in some statement of faith to get employment, that it won't be so mandatory.
Right. Yeah, one thing we did not have, one of many things, right, that we did not have time to go near was his discussion of how Christ's suffering gives our suffering meaning. It redeems our suffering.
Yeah.
And when we experience suffering, we're entering into participating with Christ. Like, I really wanted to explore.
I know there was so much. Time was not on our side.
Yeah. Yeah. And then we got into finally asking Dr. Rillera about the vegan endeavor, our vegan theology endeavor, and how his book may have informed our endeavor to some degree.
Yeah.
And can I just say, a lot of what he said was so affirming, like surprisingly so.
Right.
I don't know if he meant to come up as so affirming, but if you listen to what he said on this subject, I don't know, like if you really take seriously what he said, I feel like it has to give Christians who listen to this some pause. If we have carnivorous Christians listening to this, I think that his words should have a lot of weight. So these are basically just some verbatim quotes that Dr. Rillera said.
Well, yeah, no, I just want to say to that, I feel like he took it seriously, right? Killing animals is something we need to be concerned about.
Yes.
And we need to acknowledge it. He didn't gloss over it. He didn't brush it off. I mean, it was legit.
I know. It was really amazing. Again, these are just some things that are kind of, as much as I could when I took notes, kind of direct quotes. If not literally direct quotes, then these are very, very close to what he said. He said, according to the Bible, consumption of meat is a problem. That statement alone is kind of revolutionary for today's American Christian, mainstream Christian. According to the Bible, consumption of meat is a problem. He also mentioned or reiterated from what was in the book, which is that the law made the eating of animals less frequent. That was one of the effects of the way God set things up, is that people would be eating animals less frequently because of all the ritualistic things they had to go through.
Right.
He said Christians should be very uncomfortable with eating animals. Scripture demands that a spirit of lament should accompany the eating of animals. And he says Scripture demands we should be uncomfortable with the deaths and the overconsumption of animals in our current situation. And we should eat animals with a spirit of confession. And of course, he said that we are clearly in circumstances in which things are not as they should be. And he referenced like Romans 8. Things like that.
Right.
It was so interesting that he was just like, look, all you need as your defense is Genesis 1 and Isaiah 11, which is what kind of along the lines of some of what we've said, that in the beginning, it was clear that God set things up in a vegan way.
Right.
And Isaiah 11 alludes to the ultimate kingdom of God.
Right.
And says that there's going to be no predation. It's going to be a vegan existence.
Right.
So God's original plan, God's ultimate plan, vegan. He said, at the very least, we should be consuming less meat than we are. We certainly shouldn't glamorize the eating of meat because it is a tragedy. Whenever there is a killing, something has gone terribly wrong. Thinking about even some pastors I've known in my life who, it's 4th of July, I'm going to post on Facebook, I'm an American, I'm a God-loving American, it's God's guts and glory, and here I am barbecuing hamburgers. And
Right.
it's all part of the masculine, patriotic, American Christian shtick.
Yeah.
This glamorization of we get to eat red meat or whatever. The idea that whenever there's a killing, something has gone terribly wrong. And so we should not be celebrating. We should not be glamorizing. Actually, quite the opposite. We should be in a mode of confession and lament.
Yeah.
He also said we should be bearing the literal cost of meat, eggs, and dairy, which we absolutely are not in our food system, bearing the literal cost of those things. Within a more just and humane food systems, the current food system has made us worse creatures for it.
Right. Yeah. In addition to that, like not glamorizing, which we know our American culture is so good at. And I think we all know that the 4th of July is the ultimate or the biggest American holiday. And really we've both experienced 4th of July's in America, and it's like a big gluttonous affair.
Mm-hmm.
And we pull out all the stops, and there's just too much food. There's too many fireworks. There's too much of everything. There's too much consumerism, or what we like to say, conspicuous consumption on the 4th of July. It's the ultimate holiday of American debauchery, in my opinion. We know people who think that we've lost our marbles and that we shouldn't even care about this topic. You care about animals? Like it shouldn't even be a discussion point. Somehow in their minds it's neutral. It's not a moral issue. And I think the moment either one of us hears that, our first thought in our minds, whether we would say it or not, is that, wow, you are so enculturated by this culture that you don't think this is a moral issue. I mean, you are a complete product of all the propaganda that has been pushed at you since you were a child. And so we do need to be concerned about this. And I think kind of what Rillera was getting at is that, and he also, one of the things he did talk about is how we're separated from our food system. And that's very deliberate in our culture. And it's so easy to be agnostic. It's so easy to be agnostic about this particular food issue. Like there's no morality to be concerned here. There's no ethical issue here. We should have no scruples because we're so separated. And yet he's saying, wait, we need to get reconnected to our food system. We need to know where our food is coming from. And the moment we do, then the moment we're going to start caring. And the moment we're going to start realizing how horrific it is for these sentient beings who, oh, by the way, according to the Bible, have a soul. Yeah. And at that point, then I think it's what he's talking about. We need to lament this. Like we accept the food system we have, but it's our jobs as Christians with agency to start changing that.
Yeah. I was pleasantly surprised at some of the strong statements he made about how this is a moral issue, like you said. All right. But Rillera did say a few things that we would like to put our 2 cents in, right?
Yeah.
We have a few things that we would like to add into the conversation that we really didn't get a chance to. And maybe it just really wasn't the venue for it.
Right.
But here's our venue now.
And again, we recognize that if we were in conversation with Dr. Rillera, that he would have various points along the way. So again, we're not holding him to anything really. We're just expressing some of our thoughts.
Absolutely. And a lot of these things that we're about to address were either mentioned by Rillera or insinuated by Rillera. And the reason I think it's important to address these things is that so many of them, I believe, and I think we can back it up with some facts, are common misconceptions out there about these topics. So the first one I really wanted to address was this idea that veganism, being a vegan, living a vegan life, eating plant-based, is unattainable. I think that was his word, that eating this way is an unattainable lifestyle for example, his students.
Right.
Or for people who are not wealthy. This drives me crazy a little bit. A lot of these things do. But this idea that is out there in the waters we swim or the air we breathe, right, is this message that being a vegan is for wealthy, white, privileged people who have nothing better to do than to decide to be vegan, right?
Right.
And that any working class or someone below the poverty line, this is absolutely out of the question. So I would just like to say, okay, stop. Stop the machine and let's actually talk about this, because for all time, for all of human history, right, the poorest people on the planet have lived plant-based or primarily plant-based.
Right.
The cheapest foods have always been rice, beans, legumes, right? Fruits, vegetables, pasta, peanut butter, bread. These are like the cheapest things you can find in a grocery store. We know several college students. We live in a college town who are vegans. Some of our vegan friends are the opposite of wealthy. They're living very frugal, simple lives. They don't own cars.
Right.
We could go on.
And by the way, Bozeman is very expensive.
It's a very expensive town.
Yeah.
And yet we know people who, with very little means, are thriving on a vegan diet. So don't believe this lie that is out there that the poorest people have to live off of cheese and hot dogs and hamburger. No.
Well, that just reminds me, we both met at Bible college and we went on a mission trip to South Africa and Southern Africa. And a lot of the African villages that we visited, and this is with the Amazigh people, if you recall, they gave us a lamb because this was like a big event. They didn't normally eat chicken or lamb.
No.
And the reason they were offering it to us is because we were special guests, but normally it wasn't a normal part of their diet.
No.
So,
and Rillera did allude to that. Poor people can't be out there killing their livestock every day. That's just unsustainable. It has to be a special occasion type of thing. Like these animals need time to reproduce. Rillera did acknowledge that. So I would just like to counter this idea that being a vegan is a privileged position by saying quite the opposite. The idea that we have the right and need to eat animals and animal products every single day, 3 times a day, that is the privileged position. In fact, it's been said, it's been backed up with studies, that if everyone on the planet ate the standard American diet, we would need 4 Earths to feed everybody.
right.
Like, it's so crazily unsustainable how greedy the standard American diet is.
Right.
And if everyone ate animals all the time, like we do as Americans,
Right, as Americans.
we would need 4 Earths
Right.
just to feed everybody. However, if everyone ate a plant-based diet, we would not only free up 75% of the land we currently use for agriculture. Think about that. Freeing up 75% of our agricultural land, but we could feed 10 billion people if everyone was eating plant-based. And in case you didn't know, that's way more people than we have living on the planet.
Well, I think we could both riff on this for a little while. So this is an interesting statistic. We talk about drought, we talk about climate change, all these things. And yet one of the biggest points is that animal agriculture is the dominant colonial oppressive system. And so every year we feed about 70 billion land animals.
70 billion.
70 billion, while approximately 826 million people suffer from hunger worldwide. We have more than enough food to feed everyone on this planet.
If we weren't feeding it to animals.
But 75% of that food that we grow is given to animals. And so why are we processing our food through an animal? And I mean, this is just a point that I bring up in another show we do, is this concept of return on investment, or ROI. If this was an investment, if you were investing your money in this, it costs so much money to invest in this process. And it's so expensive that even the animal agricultural industry isn't even paying the full price. It's so subsidized by American taxpayers that we're paying for it. It doesn't even make sense. If you want to push back against the dominant culture, colonial culture, the best thing you could do is not eat animals.
Yeah. And if you want to change our food systems, the best thing you could do is stop supporting them.
Yeah, and I just want to make one other point just to hammer this home. We just watched the documentary Slay recently, and it was about the leather industry. And I think before we watched it, I thought it was pretty horrific that one hamburger equals 660 gallons of water. And that's all the water it takes for the animal to live and whatever. Think about that. 660 gallons is one hamburger. A steak is like 1,200 gallons. But like a pair of leather shoes, if you're going to process one cow's hide, the amount of water it takes to process one cowhide is 26,000 gallons of water.
Mm-hmm.
And the leather industry is tied to the animal agriculture industry. And so we keep hearing about drought, and it's just ridiculous when you think about it. So an average pair of leather shoes, 2,100 gallons of water.
Now, having said that, we are aware that there are, in the inner cities of our great nation, there are what we call food deserts, where the people living in these inner city poor neighborhoods literally have no access to decent grocery stores, to fresh produce, to whole food. There was a documentary called They're Trying to Kill Us, exactly about this, that
Right.
poor racial minority neighborhoods often live in these food deserts where the only access to food they have are fast food restaurants
Right.
or convenience stores.
Right.
So we're aware that there are places like that. We're aware that on Native American reservations, the cost of fresh produce is astronomical. Like, this is unjust.
Right.
And I am a little bit aware that in Canada, fresh produce is really expensive. There's a woman from Canada. She goes by the name of the Scrappy Vegan. She's published Scrappy Cooking, Zero Waste Recipes that are good for you, your wallet, and the planet. And I've heard her interviewed, and she caught my ear. This fresh produce in Canada is super expensive. We're aware that there are places where, in actuality, it is really difficult to be plant-based. And of course, this is one of those areas where we would cover that with grace.
Right.
Like, we understand the system has made it really hard, if not impossible for you. We're not talking to people who live in the tundra or people who live in a food desert.
Right.
We're talking to all the other people who, like us, happen to have like a dozen grocery stores within driving distance and who do have the choice. I saw a webinar being advertised recently where they were addressing this myth that only the very rich can be vegan. And their claim for the webinar is, we're going to teach you how you can thrive on a vegan diet for less than $7 a day. And I would just say, like, college students especially are very ingenious and very resourceful, and they can learn
Right.
how to eat plant-based really cheaply. I was in a grocery store this week, and I noticed that the bulk rice and beans and legumes are like 78 cents a pound.
Right.
We know that once you cook them, you get a lot more than a pound.
Right. What plays into what you just said is that, especially in America and probably in most Western countries, I know in America we're a consumer-driven economy. And what that means is that what people buy, they're going to sell. They're going to create and keep selling. So if the dominant people, the wealthy, and the people who can afford to eat animals and animal products, if they started making choices that didn't include animals and animal products, they would start to change the food system. They would start to change the culture. One of the things that Rillera talked about was policy change. Yeah, I think policy change is part of it, but I also, like I'm saying, we are a consumer-driven economy. And if people stop consuming animals and animal products, that will change it faster than any policy, right? And it will change it for the minorities because more healthy, whole food, plant-based options will be available. And I think one other point I want to make that when you talked about the inner city is that, remember, we know a vegan doctor named Dr. Milton Mills. He's African-American. And I think one of the points he likes to make is that most African-Americans are lactose intolerant. And yet the federal government likes to give them, I'm not sure what the program's called now, if it's still called WIC or whatever, but say some sort of subsidy system that gives them cow's milk. Well, they're lactose intolerant. They can't accept it. So his view, which I think is very, I want to say funny, but very, I don't know what the right word is, but he's almost like the American government is trying to kill African Americans. Yeah. Which is just pretty strong words.
I think he calls it, just another like systematic racism or systemic racism within our government. Yeah. So that was the first thing I wanted to address, is that you can live very frugally on a vegan diet. The second thing, Rillera didn't really hit this point hard, but I did hear him allude to the idea of even you as vegans are contributing to plant death, the death of plants.
Right.
And what are the moral implications of that? That is something that comes up a lot. And it's one of those things that I don't accuse Rillera of this at all, but other people throw this at a vegan. Oh, you think you're morally superior to me? Well, you kill plants.
Or plants are sentient, right?
Yeah. What if plants feel pain? Those are kinds of ideas. So first of all, I would just like to start with the Dharmic traditions have it right when they say that there's inherent violence in every action. Every action has some degree of violence within it. The point in this broken world, so mixing some Christian theology into this, that we live in a broken world. And the point is to minimize the amount of violence that we contribute to. The vegan mindset is not somehow that our hands are clean and that we are perfectly leading a peaceful life and not contributing to any cruelty or any violence. The vegan life is about how can we minimize the amount of suffering?
Right.
Okay, so I would just say that first. But if you care about the death of plants and want to minimize the death of plants, you need to be a plant-based person. You need to eat plant-based because, as Kevin, as you alluded to earlier, the vast majority of crops we grow get fed to livestock.
Right.
And so if you know anything about the laws of thermodynamics, which I know very little, but the second law of thermodynamics is all about energy loss as energy is being transferred. And it's just science that in order to feed an animal, not just enough for the animal to live, but enough to bulk up that animal and put on weight in that animal as quickly as you can to get the maximum profit out of that animal's body, you have to feed that animal so much more than you would ever have to feed a person.
Right.
So
or just a normal animal. If you just let the animal just be an animal, let a cow be a cow. He's not going to eat as much as the farmer rancher wants to put into him.
Yes. The idea that even if we do prove that plants have some level of sentience, which to me just proclaims the glory of God even more, I do believe that all parts of creation are to be revered. But again, if you want to minimize suffering, stop eating animals because we know they suffer.
Right.
And they want to live, and they eat way more plants than people do.
Well, I think the point I want to make, which keeps coming up, is we mentioned Genesis 1:29, God gave us plants to eat. Well, guess what? Plants are alive. We're supposed to be eating live things, not dead things.
Yeah.
And so that was a provision by God. And one other nice point, Dr. Milton Mills likes to remind us all that all protein comes from plants. All protein.
Yep.
Starts with plants.
I'm really glad you brought that up because in the Christian context, when people say, well, you kill plants, so you're not morally superior to me. Well, okay, but God commanded we eat plants. God created plants and then told the humans and all the animals, this is what I gave you to eat.
Right.
This is my plan. I guess let's not argue with God. Okay. Again, another point that Dr. Rillera alluded to just very, very briefly, but I want to hit it because this is a misconception that a lot of people have, which is that there's no death required in the consumption of milk and eggs. So false.
Yeah.
or like Rillera says, no. Wrong. I could spend a lot of time on this and I don't want to, but suffice it to say, okay, as quickly as I can, let's just start with milk. Let's start with dairy. No, I'm going to back up again a step. I'm going to make the statement that there is more death and more cruelty and more suffering in the dairy industry and the egg industry than there is even in the beef industry or the broiler chicken industry. These industries are so full of suffering and cruelty and death. What people need to remember, I would like people to remember, is that cows only make milk if they just had a baby. Just like any other mammal. They don't just make milk. If you see a cow who's making milk, it's because she just had a baby. So, what does that mean? It means that cow is way earlier than what is natural for her. The farmer is giving her drugs, hormones, to force her to start ovulating so that she can become impregnated as early as possible. She gives birth to a baby so that she will start producing milk. And of course, the farmer cannot allow that baby to drink up that commodity. That baby is immediately removed from the mother. And it's well documented how much the mothers cry for their babies and how much the babies cry for their mothers. Well, if that baby happens to be a male, in the dairy industry, that baby is officially considered a waste product. That baby cow, that baby boy cow in the dairy industry will never grow big enough to be worth anything to the beef industry unless the farmer has a deal with a veal farmer where the baby's going to be killed in a few months anyway. That boy baby will be killed pretty much immediately within the first few days of his life. Again, well documented. This is standard practice in the industry. If that mother gives birth to a female, well, the farmer rejoices because now we have another moneymaker. But she's still separated from her mother immediately, and she's fed watered-down formula until she can become impregnated and start the cycle again. These dairy cows are impregnated every year, over and over and over again. Left alone with just adequate food and shelter, cows can live 30 years. These dairy cows, I mean, any mother can sympathize, right? We know the toll that constant pregnancy, constant delivery, constant lactation has on a woman's body, right? Dairy cows, their bodies give out at 5 years. And once their milk production slows down, they're killed.
Right.
For cheap beef.
For beef. Exactly.
In fact, most hamburger comes from dairy cows,
right.
Spent dairy cows. And of course, these cows, because they're being milked intensively all the time, of course, they have horrible raging infections of mastitis.
Right.
And if they're unfortunate enough to be existing on an organic dairy farm where they cannot be given antibiotics, those infections go completely untreated. There's no humane way of commodifying a sentient being. And milk, dairy is very cruel.
Right. And it's worth noting, right, that this, if you really stop and think about what we're saying, forced rape, and then just this turning a body into this machine.
Having your baby taken away from you.
Having your baby taken away from you.
Over and over and
right.
over.
And just your body abused until it's pushed to its ultimate limit where you're no longer viable as a... Profitable. And then you're killed. And so it's like...
It's slavery.
It's slavery. It's hell on earth.
Yeah.
And so if you care about females, many feminists...
Yeah.
who are vegan identify with this whole issue.
Absolutely.
And if you care about egalitarian values, if you care about inclusivity, you would not consume any kind of dairy products.
Right. It's atheism, basically. It cannot align with a God of life.
Right.
I have to say something about eggs, too. And again, I don't want to belabor the point, but once again, when they're hatching new laying hens, half of those babies who hatch are males. And guess what? Males in the egg-laying industry are waste products. They will never grow big enough to account for anything in the chicken meat industry. So what happens to the baby male chicks? They are literally macerated the day they are born. They are macerated alive.
Yeah, they are ground alive. And if you think about that, that's like, let's just rule of thumb, 50% of the eggs ground into a meal while they're alive. And again, think about the ROI on that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And even the idea of the modern chicken, the modern hen, is so messed up. What humans have done is we took the guinea fowl, who, like every other bird on this planet, lays one or at the most 2 clutches of eggs a year, and then hatches them and raises them. We took this beautiful bird and we have genetically manipulated her to the point where now she ovulates basically every day of the year. She lays an egg 300 plus times a year.
Right.
just for our profit.
Right.
Of course, that's not natural. Of course, they're prisoners in their own body. Every time, I mean, the amount of calcium that leaches from her bones every time she lays an egg,
Right.
which is why they have to be on such heavily fortified feed. But bone fractures are the norm. We've genetically manipulated them so that their eggs are way too big.
Right. Well, and I think too, right, we've created these Frankensteins. And I think the other thing that it brings up is this other documentary and these facts that we know about a documentary called The Smell of Money, where if you care about minority people and poor communities, then you'll understand if you watch The Smell of Money that these animal agriculture industries are, a lot of them, their factories are close to impoverished communities. And what happens when you have all these animals is they also produce a lot of waste product. And they have these cesspools of this animal waste. And so the ranchers and the farmers are trying to get rid of it. So what they do is they spray it on their fields, the food that they're feeding these animals, well, it goes airborne. Well, now you've got people in these communities, humans, who are breathing in animal waste into their lungs, and they're having all kinds of respiratory issues and cancers and all kinds of human disease as a result of animal agriculture. So,
Right.
If you care about the poor and the impoverished, you will stop eating animals.
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things we learned from Rillera's book is that in God's eyes, economic oppression is bloodshed. It's equal to murder. And one thing that the giant meat companies, the giant dairy industry, they set up shop right next door to these poor communities and basically take away all quality of life for these people.
Right.
Like, this would never fly in affluent neighborhoods.
No.
Nobody cares because they're doing it in poor minority neighborhoods.
Right. And so as you continue to eat animals, you're supporting the abuse of humans.
Yes, of course. And that's not even to talk about who they employ,
Right.
slaughterhouse workers, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Okay, another point. Rillera mentioned in passing that kosher communities, I think he was making the point that people who work together to try to be more just in their consumption habits can do a better, can have more success than individuals on their own. I would just want to make the statement that kosher is in fact not more humane. And again, this is well documented. People have gone into kosher farms, kosher slaughterhouses, and have documented that they are every bit as cruel and inhumane as your standard factory farms and your standard slaughterhouses.
I just recently learned about a vegan Jewish rabbi. His name is Dr. Shmuley Yanklowitz, and he has some conferences and seminars, but he was making a point, and I need to go study it further, but from a biblical point of view, he was sort of suggesting that the whole concept of kosher has changed throughout the history of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So what it meant in ancient Israeli times and what it means now are different. And he was almost suggesting that in the beginning, like in Genesis, kosher was vegan.
Yep.
And now, in the state that we're in today,
yeah,
we should be eating kosher, should be vegan.
Because it's very possible to survive.
Right.
Whereas maybe after the flood, it wasn't as possible.
Right.
Right.
So we need to investigate that further.
Yes,
but I just want to
absolutely.
bring that point up.
And clearly, God put what now is referred to as kosher. God put these rules in place, as we talked about when we were going through Rillera's book, to minimize the suffering of animals. Like, there's a right way to kill an animal. There's a better way. Let's use that word. There's a better way to kill an animal than out of all the ways you could kill an animal. God told them to do it in a way that would cause the least amount of suffering.
Right.
So it's sad that what started out as a practice that was meant to minimize suffering now is pretty meaningless when it comes to the treatment of animals in practice. Another point, Rillera said that Jesus ate the Passover lamb. As far as I know, there is no evidence scripturally that Jesus actually partook of any Passover lamb.
Right.
So...
But we're looking for a reference. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Rillera a couple times was like, and God is the one that said, I'm going to take you to a land flowing with milk and honey. Like, that doesn't sound very vegan. And again, this is something that's been tossed out in conversation with lots of other people as well. So I don't know how to answer this completely, but I do have a few thoughts. I found a Biblical Archaeology Society article, and it shed a little bit of light on that this phrase, land flowing with milk and honey, was a very common phrase at that time with a lot of different peoples. So there's a Ugaritic text that actually credits Baal, the Canaanite god Baal, with this phrase. So in a Ugaritic text, Baal is saying, I'm going to take you to a land flowing with milk and honey. So this just starts to open up the idea that this was just common parlance, and it was just shorthand for, I'm going to take you to a really great place where there's going to be plenty.
Right.
Almost like the way we would say, stick with me and everything will come up roses, or stick with me, kid, and there'll be diamonds at your feet. Or, it's just like this phrase that was thrown out. This article also points out that the Hebrews themselves use this phrase to refer to Egypt. They say, hey, you took us out of a land flowing with milk and honey to bring us out to die in the wilderness. So again, this was just a phrase that people used for when living is easy. Also, there is Slavic Czech mythology, which probably does not go back as far as the Hebrews. There's a mythology from the Slavic Czech culture that also had this phrase in it. It just seems like in ancient times or in times past, this was a very common phrase that was thrown around. And again, I think there's a case to be made that it just meant, I'm going to take you to a place where you're going to be on easy street.
Right. And I think, just what you're saying, the Hebrew was two of the predecessors to the Hebrew language, I believe, were Ugaritic and Akkadian. So kind of what you're saying is it was this ancient Near Eastern cultural thing.
Right.
What do we call it?
An idiom.
Idiom.
Yeah. And I mean, and even Rillera did say whenever the scripture does seem to accept predation or exploitation of animals or whatever, we need to remember that should be nested within the greater truth, which is that God is a God of life, not a God of death. God is not a God of exploitation.
Right.
God is a God of mutually affirming freedom and flourishing. Do we really want to misrepresent God as someone who's fine with exploitation and commodification of creatures?
Right.
So,
his creation.
Right. I really did appreciate Rillera's pastoral advice that he gave us. I think it was good for us to hear and to heed and to take to heart, which is that veganism cannot become some kind of criteria by which we measure other people's discipleship or their relationship with God. And we have to come from a position of mercy. We cannot villainize or demonize carnivores or farmers or whomever. We have to be willing to stay in fellowship with our brothers and sisters who don't become vegan.
I know I want to make a comment on this point too, because it's hard to know what kind of vibe you give off if you're vegan. I mean, I know for both of us, or at least for me, I say I'm vegan and people assume I'm some radical liberal, politically, and I'm not. But my point is this: you and I are very moderate, and I feel like we're very relational. And we were hosting another show locally for a local radio station, a small radio station. It was a vegan show, and we had another host with us. And she was very proudly, she would say she was a fundamentalist vegan. And we were not vegan enough, or we were not fundamentalist enough for her. And she eventually parted ways with us. And she likes to do activism on the street. But things that we wanted to do, or at least that I wanted to do, is I wanted to actually go interview ranchers and say, hey, like, let's get your point of view. Like, let's, instead of demonizing them, let's hear from them. And maybe we'll have influence on them. But she didn't want to give them the time of day. Like, that would be blasphemy for us to give any airtime to anything that some rancher, meat eater, carnivore would say. And so I think we were a lot more open-minded about it. And I think that's where we are. And so the fact that we're vegan and we're pushing a vegan theology, we're very open-minded. We're not, I mean, I like to push buttons, don't get me wrong, but At the end of the day, I think we're not fundamentalists.
Right.
In fact, I think we try to avoid that. I think we're trying to be biblical. And I think this gets into another point we're going to make here about agency that he brought up.
Yeah. I would just add to what you're saying that, I mean, members of our own immediate family are not vegan and think that we're a little bit crazy. And we gather with them for meals. We gather with them for holidays and birthdays. And we sit at the table with them while they're eating animals and animal products. And yeah, it's a tension. There's tension there. There's tension for us because we do believe that it's contributing to cruelty and suffering and unnecessary death. And they don't see it that way. And so, yeah, we live in this tension and it's hard, right? It's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. But yeah, we're not willing to break off fellowship.
Right. I just want to clarify when you say tension, there's not this like thickness in the air.
I'm feeling it internally.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think the good news in those meals is that they're not glamorizing the eating of animals because of our views. Right. I think we have a good relationship with our close family.
Right. Another thing Rillera brought up was we don't want to create apathy. We don't want to be like, oh, and your laptop contributed to child slavery and your phone contributed to child slavery and the clothes you wear are made by people who are basically slaves and the car you drive and your dwelling place is built on Native American stolen land. And all of a sudden, what we want to avoid is someone throwing up their hands and saying, okay, so I can't do anything without sinning.
Right.
Therefore, nothing matters.
Yeah, why should I bother?
Right.
With anything. For me, what I hear right there, because this plays in the whole agency thing that he brought up, and I thought it was interesting. He said we have agency. Yeah. And I feel like God gave us agency in the beginning, in Genesis, when he said we were made in the image of God. And what we talked about in one of our earliest episodes was that the imago Dei, or the image of God, is not some part of our soul or spirit or something in our DNA, but it's a title. It's a title that we are viceroys. We are co-creators with God. Like Adam was a co-creator with God. When God was done creating the earth and humans, creation wasn't done. Adam was to pick up the mantle and continued, like he organized, he named the animals, he put organization to this creation. And that's what if the fall had never happened, that's what we would be doing. And that's what we're still trying to do. And that's what we're going to be doing in the eternal state when sin and predation are removed. And so my point here is this is the tension that I fall into as a Christian, and it drives me insane. To me, this is the one issue. We are in the already not yet. We know what the goal is. And what agency do we have? I mean, that's the question to me. What is God's part? What is our part?
Right.
What are we supposed to be doing? And if I know that we're not going to be eating animals in the eternal state, then why would I eat them now?
Totally.
And why would I abuse another sentient being now if I know they're not going to be abused in the future? And there's going to be no predation. Yeah. It's going to be nonviolent. So why not start practicing that now? That's what I don't understand. And this drives me insane. Like, we have agency. Let's start using it now.
Yeah. It is a tension, and it does come up constantly. This idea that people will say, only God can bring God's kingdom. We cannot bring God's kingdom through our own efforts. We cannot do it. Great, fine. And another thing people add on, it's a pagan idea to believe that God needs us.
Right.
I agree. God doesn't need us. However, I would also assert that clearly God has given us a job. God has chosen to give us a job.
Right. But that's exactly what we just said. Yeah, we're not doing God's job. God gave us a job.
Yeah.
Well, and this is also something that he alluded to. Like, he briefly mentioned, like, this could start to sound post-millennial. I've been very clear. We have never really cared much about premillennialism, postmillennialism, amillennialism. We go right to the eternal state. I don't care about all the eschatological inner workings of all these different theological systems. I go right to the eternal state. And so we're talking about the eternal state. We're not talking about some millennial state. Yeah. And the point there is that there was a belief before World War I, I believe, that humans and the earth and things were getting better. And that was the dominant view that many theologians held, was a view called post-millennialism. And then after World War I and World War II, they all kind of ditched it. because they're like, clearly humans are not getting better. There are still some theologians today who still hold on to it and still promote it, like Ken Gentry and the guy named Doug Banson. He's passed. But my point is, we're not pushing postmillennialism. I just want to be very clear about that. We're talking about the eternal state.
Yeah. Well, something you said about the viceroy idea, that's how I understand, or we've read, and I don't remember who, but to frame the Lord's Prayer with this understanding that when a subject says to a royal, your will be done, the subject's not saying, okay, go ahead and do what you want to do, royal. The subject's saying, I understand your will, and I am going to go make sure it gets executed.
Right.
So when we say your will be done on earth, we're saying we understand what you want, God. We understand your vision, and we're going to do everything we can within our power to execute it.
Right.
Okay, I think I just have one more. This one makes me a little nervous too, but I gotta say it. And I could be so wrong. I could totally be missing the point.
Right. And help us out if you're out there and you think we're missing the point, and we will gladly accept your feedback.
Rillera said, and it's not just Rillera. I read it in a footnote of his book by someone else, and I don't have the name on the top of my head. But what was stated was, he said, you can't say that the prophets and Jesus were criticizing the sacrificial system, because that sounds anti-Semitic. And that just doesn't sit well with me at all. Look, I understand, I really do, that the church has a tragic, shameful history of anti-Semitism, and we should be ashamed of that, and we should make sure that we cut that out. But to approach exegesis as, okay, well, whatever we do, we don't want to sound anti-Semitic.
Right.
If that's your motivator for how you're reading scripture, is make sure we don't say anything that could possibly be construed as anti-Semitic, that just doesn't feel like a good way to approach exegesis. So, in other words, I think we should have the freedom to say, maybe Jesus was saying, hey, let's move beyond the sacrificial system. I've got something better.
Right.
I think we should have the freedom to say that without fear of being labeled an anti-Semite.
Right. Well, look, I hear his point. I hear your point. I mean, our job as exegetes in this 21st century culture is to be sensitive to the culture, but also bring out God's word. And we use the term contextualization. Like we're trying to make it meaningful to our 21st century today. And I think in that, I just want to make the point too. I think when we were in Bible college, we had started, this was early on, this was in the 90s, and this is before the internet took off like it is today, and we didn't have social media and all that good stuff. But we were trying to create something like a blog, but it was more of a thing that we'd write these articles, and then people could respond to them in the comments. That was kind of a big thing back early 2000s. Anyway, I had written an article, and I don't know what I said. I can't remember all of it, but basically a Jewish person responded, and they were essentially suggesting that just us saying that Christ was the only way to God, which is a standard Christian view, like that was anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Like we can't say that our religion is the right one. And I'm not, you know what I mean? That was the implication that we were being anti-Semitic because we were making that point.
Yeah. I don't think we're alone in asserting that labeling people anti-Semitic sometimes it gets overused. So,
right. And I think,
is there anti-Semitism? Absolutely. And is that evil and a sin? Absolutely. But we need to be careful about labeling everything as anti-Semitic,
right,
when it's not.
And I will say that I might personally, this conversation, I'm not exactly 100% comfortable with it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I am not.
No, of course.
I am not settled with this. I am not necessarily trying to promote a view. I am just saying that we're trying to promote our vegan theology view, and that playing into that comes this whole sacrificial system, and we're going to have to deconstruct it. And if we do that, if we're anti-Semitic, that is not our intention.
No. I hope that we shed some light on some of the statements that were made in the interview. I don't know. Next, I kind of want to just look at the fact that we started this journey exploring as vegans, as vegan theologians, how do we view animal sacrifice within God's will? How does this all line up? And I think this is a good time to just kind of reflect back, like, okay, what have we learned? Where have we landed on that subject? Do you want me to start?
Go for it.
This is where I've landed, and Kevin, you can definitely speak for yourself. I think clearly it's well established, and I definitely think that it's just a fact that animal sacrifice within the Hebrew context was clearly adopted from the ancient Near Eastern culture. It was a pervasive, ubiquitous practice in the ancient world. All the pagans were sacrificing animals, and it was adopted by the Hebrews. And also, it's well established that ancient civilizations used ritual to assuage their guilty consciences for killing and eating animals. And whether that was the hunting-gathering societies who had ritual when they went hunting, or it was the agricultural societies who had these sacrificial rituals when they killed animals. I would also say that I think it was a huge point that we learned that the law/God said that killing an animal outside of these prescribed ritualistic ways is murder. It's bloodshed, which is one of the 3 grave sins. The law/God also diminished how many animals were being killed and eaten just because of all the ritual that was put in place, just automatically minimized how much people were doing it. And then this mysterious, amazing attribute of God, that he enters into human context and human cultural understanding, and he works within what people understand, is what I see happening here. God entered into the ancient Near Eastern mind and worked with their culture. And the New Testament writers clearly continue to use the language of temple and altar just as a continuation because it was still very much part of the culture. But at the end of the day, no, I do not believe that animal sacrifice was ever part of God's original ideal, nor was it a part of his original intention for creation or for our relationship with God.
Right. No, I agree with your outline here in whole. And I think one of the things that I would love to do is I still want to do some deeper research and analysis on the ancient Near Eastern cultures and try to, if I can, connect some dots to Israel, like more clearly. I would love to be able to really hone in on that trail, so to speak. But no, I can't disagree with what you're saying.
Yeah. All right. So, Dr. Rillera, if you're listening, we just want to say thank you again. Yeah. You gave us some much appreciated validation, as well as some really great pastoral advice for how to proceed.
And you wrote a great book, and it's possibly a very vegan book, whether you realize it or not.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
So we have lots of ideas of where we're going to go from here.
Yeah.
So tune in.
And I think we want to be a little more consistent. I think the last couple of months here have been a little, life's thrown a few curveballs at us, and we want to get a little more consistent at topics. So got all kinds of things to talk about. I mean, even this whole discussion and things that Dr. Rillera brought up in his book, I mean, it's just created more questions to go pursue, things to look at and analyze. So anyway, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Later.